But so we got Joe in Toronto. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you for taking my call. Been a fan of the show for about a year so far. It's been great.
Thank you.
So just to tell you a bit of my background, I grew up Coptic Orthodox. I'm not sure if you know about them, but they're the National Christian Church of Egypt. I grew up in Canada, and they're a very, very Orthodox church that has been, and very conservative, that's been relatively persecuted in the past and in the present. And there's a lot of Sorry, go ahead.
So now this is me kind of piecing bits together because I'm familiar a little bit with various versions of Orthodox. And you said Coptic Orthodox. Is that because of the location, or is it because of appeals to extra biblical Coptic scriptures?
No, location. It's
Okay.
Coptic in this mean they're an Oriental
Egypt.
Orthodox church. So
okay.
So there's nothing extra, nothing from Coptic scripture. Basically, they're non-Chalcedonian. So they only believe in they only adhere to the first three councils. And after that, things take a bit of an authoritarian regime because nobody really knows what the doctrine is. Things get muffled, and because they were under Islamic rule for so long, things have been a bit warped, I guess would be the way I would say it. But I wanted to appeal to you when you were a Christian. I wanted to ask you, growing up as a Christian, and I'm an atheist now, I've never had a connection to the emotional suffering of Christ. To me, Jesus dying on the cross or rising in 3 days, it didn't seem to be as impactful to me as, the stories of martyrs or, people crying when they see the Passion or watching a Passion play or really feeling that emotion. And I just wondered if you felt that growing up when you were a Christian.
Yeah, I'm sure there were times. I remember going to Passion plays, and when I was younger, there's certainly an emotional aspect of the story. I have to admit that it probably didn't resonate with me as much as it did with some other people, because there were, I think, some unformed nagging concerns, which I can easily express now. Now, when I look at it, I don't see, even if the story were completely true, I don't see that as anything remotely like a sacrifice. Go ahead, beat me, rip me to shreds, let me be dead for 3 days, and then I get to wake up and I'm God. How the hell is that a sacrifice? I mean, you had one shitty weekend. I mean, it was a really, really bad weekend, but only part of it was a bad weekend. The rest of it, you were dead. Now, when I was a kid, though, I didn't look at it in those terms. It was always portrayed as God loves you. You are damned to hell because of your sin, and Jesus came down to pay the price for that. So my connection with it wasn't so much, oh my gosh, look how much this individual suffered, because I think even then I recognized, hey, wait a minute, he gets to be God, or he is God to start with, and gets to be God again, or who knows, because God can't die, so there's got to be some gap there. It doesn't make any sense. But it was about not so much the sacrifice itself, but the act that allowed us to be redeemed. There was certainly an appreciation for that, but I don't think there was an emotional connection to the suffering. And by the time that Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ came out, I just found it a combination of laughable and gory.
Yeah, and I agreed with you. I thought it was
Christian snuff porn.
And when I was a Christian at the time, I just thought it was disgusting.
Yeah.
But when I would argue with that to them, with other Christians, they would take it as you didn't understand, or you don't feel for Christ's suffering. And I think that might be part of the culture of the Coptic Church, because we are an Orthodox church. There is a lot of visual, like there's a lot of icons and a lot of chanting, and they go through the stages of the cross as well on Good Friday. So there's a lot of suffering on that day when you're not eating all day. But
I think if I could look at that and put myself back in that position, and if somebody from the church had come to me to say that maybe there's something wrong with me, that I am insufficiently empathic or empathetic, such that I can't express empathy with this sacrifice, I think my response to that even then would have been, and yet I clearly empathize with actual tragedies. I mean, I'm more likely to cry and feel empathy watching some real living human being be tortured or suffer through disease or starvation or illness or anything like that than I am a story about some supernatural being who voluntarily got beaten up.
100% agree, and like I was mentioning before, like for me, the stories of martyrs even resonated with me way more than the story of Christ. That these people would be tortured allegedly by the Roman Empire, and they probably have been, and then would be martyred without knowing for sure if there is a God that is going to save them. Those stories resonated with me more than any of the gospel stories would have.
And I want to just, John is someone who wasn't ostensibly raised with this sort of thing. When you eventually, were presented with the stories and were able to think about it, how did you view it?
It was just a story. I was trying to think of an example of another story where somebody suffered, and it's kind of like that. It's just I wouldn't feel any empathy for that either. If I was watching a movie, I might, but kind of like you were saying, it's so far removed from actual flesh and blood human. Once, whoa, just got a weird noise.
Sorry, the phone.
Okay.
Well, you're not going to miss too many phone calls like that. So, I could hear that all the way from Toronto. I think, though, I've actually had empathy for characters that I knew were fictional. And, my wife is a prime example. No, my wife's not fictional. I'm saying my wife's a prime example of this sort of thing. When a certain character dies on one of the shows that she happens to like, she knows the actor's still alive, the character's fictional, she's going to bawl like a baby. And answer your phone, dude. And so I completely understand that. And yet here we have a story which people think is real, other people think is a fictional character, and the empathy's not remotely the same. And I think that says far more about the story and the details of the story than it does about any of us. Because clearly if we were incapable of connecting with a true sacrifice, a true loss, we would, you wouldn't be able to use that criticism against us because we can empathize with real and fictional losses.
Well, and I haven't actually seen the Mel Gibson movie. I've just heard that it's bloody, over the top bloody, and I would probably have an emotional reaction to seeing that. It's kind of like I did when I saw 12 Years a Slave, or whatever that movie was called. Just seeing people whipped and suffering, regardless of who it is hard to watch. And
I didn't, and I think it's because Gibson's is so over the top. It almost becomes cartoonish to the point where you can't remotely connect with this individual. And the story itself of it being God in human form already makes it difficult for you to connect to that individual. It's, Dobby the house elf is more real to me, and I felt worse about his loss or losing him than I did about Jesus.
Yeah, and in that movie, I mean, you're right. You know what's going to happen. You know the ultimate ending in it is that he becomes God, and you're right. It was very over the top. I mean, I remember the one thing that I remember vividly from that movie is when they're putting the crown of thorns on him. They almost beat it on his head to drive the thorns into his head, which, I mean, I don't know if there's any evidence that story is even in the Bible like that, or even, believed by the Catholics or by old Catholics that that's what happened as well.
Yeah.
I did have a second comment or second statement to bring up.
Okay.
So I lived in Canada my whole life. I'm in my 30s. I'm independent. But the cultural connection of the Coptic Church is very similar to, like, I guess, even your previous caller. There are there are
Except they're not
decisions
likely to
that
kill you.
Sorry, what's that?
Except they're probably not going to kill you.
No, the difference is this, is um, decisions that I make could have a fundamental impact on my parents' well-being or livelihood.
Right.
And I'll give you an example. They're in business. The community we live in Toronto. I'm not sure if you're familiar with with Canada's multiculturalism, but there's an element of ghettoization where a community sticks to its own and they all live in the same area. For example, the city of Vaughan, just north of Toronto, is almost all Italian. Cities to the west in Brampton is almost all Indian, and where we are, there's a large Coptic Egyptian community. And to give you an example, if I don't marry in the church, and I would either have a common law relationship or marry somewhere else, it could have an impact on how my parents are seen in the church culturally,
Yep.
and could have a negative impact on their lives. And I don't know if you ever hear, like, I don't know if situations are similar in most American Christian communities, but it's just a comment that I want to bring up.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean, I could certainly imagine that there might be churches that, for example, my parents might go to, and if they found out that, they were the parents of the, arch atheist of Austin, that might have, there are churches where they might be, looked down upon, or they made a mistake. And I know that my parents have on occasion felt that they, failed me as a spiritual leader. But I don't think that that's the norm. I think predominantly this, much in the same way that you can have a pastor who goes out and does something absolutely horrific, and it may work out to be the best thing they could ever do, as long as they're willing to get up in front of the church, talk about what they did and how Jesus redeemed them from this and turned them from this, and now they have a stronger witness and they're better. They could end up making more money and have more kind of prominence within some churches that way. In some cases, it's the end of a pastoral career, and in some cases,
Right.
it's a bump that has a huge spike afterwards. So I really couldn't say how any individual church or even denomination would look at it. But none of it's without risk. And coming out as a non-believer, I can only really talk a bit about in the United States, but we know it has risks. We have people who've been ostracized by their families, been ostracized by their communities, in some cases kicked out of homes and had to move to a new town to find a place to live and try to live a life. And then you've got to rebuild this network. And that's why there are organizations like Recovering from Religion, the Secular Therapist Project, people dealing with religious trauma syndrome, and organizations like Sunday Assembly and Oasis, where we're building sort of landing pads for people on their way out of religion. Because if you've lost your entire community, it's so nice if there's actually another community who not only you can associate with, where there's largely like-minded people, but many of whom are coming from the same situations, where they lost their social network, where they lost members of their family, for nothing more than being intellectually honest about what they believed.
Right, and my parents are aware of who I am, and so are all my friends, and it doesn't impact us. I like the community I'm in. I think it's almost the broader society as a whole, as a micro society, in the Greater Toronto area. In general, Canada tends to be a lot more secular than the States, or at least the South, or at least Texas. And
although I was in Alberta,
Alberta's the 51st state.
Yeah.
It's so fundamentally different than Toronto.
North
Although
Texas.
they elected when we had Rob Ford, they had elected a very secular Muslim mayor in Calgary, at the same time that Toronto elected a very right-wing and ultimately very flawed Rob Ford. But I mean, an example, the United Church of Canada, the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, has had moderators come out publicly stating that they did not believe Jesus rose from the dead, which I'm not sure if some of the larger American Protestant denominations could have the same statement from a moderator.
Methodist could.
A Methodist could?
That might be about the only one. And most of the rest of them find themselves kind of in UU churches, Unitarian Universalists, which is John's expertise.
Or United Church of Christ, but they're not a major denomination anymore.
Yeah.
And Universalists were the biggest denomination in America in the 1800s, but they're small now.
Yeah, that kind of didn't pan out. And I think, personally, I don't have any problem I'm not a fan of UU churches for me, because I think that there's a lot of let's water everything down and maybe even delve into some woo or kind of get fuzzy with the language about spirituality or whatever in order to appeal to many people without offending. And I understand that and I appreciate it, and it's the right thing for some people. I'm not one of those people.
Well, you talked about having a landing pad, and in some places, UU churches may be the only landing pad an atheist might have.
Yep.
That's even close. So.
Yeah, if you don't have anything else, the UU churches, I'd rather look at it as a halfway house than a landing pad. But I'm not saying that just to be insulting. I just find it kind of amusing. Anyway, Joe, I appreciate the call.
Okay, can I ask just one more question very quickly, or?
Sure.
It's something slightly unrelated, but when people ask me about what my beliefs are, or how I identify as an atheist, I just wanted your take on this. I don't believe there is a God, in the sense that if anybody defines a God, because I don't believe that one has revealed himself to us, that definition will almost certainly be incorrect. There could be something beyond the scope that could be technically a God, but because we do not have any evidence of it, any attempt to define it would be almost positively incorrect.
Yeah, so I think the only minor subtle objection is that instead of saying there could be a God, I think it's a little more clear and accurate to say we don't know that there couldn't be. Because could is a declaration about what's possible. And right. I know there are people who are like, oh, well, anything's possible. And I'm not actually convinced that that's the case, because we know that there are some things that are at least logically contradictory. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I'm not overly picky about the labels people use or how they choose to explain it, because it may take a number of different explanation styles for people to get it. And what's more important, I think, is I don't want people to be able to say they've never met a non-believer, they've never met an atheist, and they've never met any atheist or non-believer who can't give an account for why they don't believe. That's one of the reasons I do what I do. And if they walk away with their faith strengthened, yeah, okay, that's a little annoying, but at least they were able to consider it. But they don't ever get to say that, oh, atheists, I guess they can keep saying it since they do, but they can't have any good justification for doing atheists are just mad at God, or you're professed atheists and you actually do believe in God, because that's a bunch of crap.
Right. Anyways, thanks, Matt. It was great talking to you today.
Thanks, Joe. We can, I guess we'll get Thaddeus from Springfield hooked up on here next. So on the landing pad front versus halfway house, I have virtually no experience in a UU church. It's all been secondhand information from people, and I know that they're incredibly good on like sex education, which we've talked about before. Just for the benefit of the people who aren't familiar, if you were to go to a UU church on a Sunday, what would you expect?
It's very much like the typical Protestant church experience. You'll go in and you'll get a program, and now this, I guess I should have a caveat that all churches are different.
Sure.
And they all kind of have their own flavor, but typically there'll be a choir, or there'll be a couple of hymns, and there's a sermon, and the sermon can be, it can run the gamut from about other religions or some philosophical point or, social justice kind of thing. It just, it's typically up to the minister, and some ministers kind of have their own strengths and areas they like to talk about. But it's very typical as far as what a lot of churches do as far as format goes. And then it just kind of has a more, depending on the church, it has a more universal feel where they try to avoid the male God language and try to be,
So
broaden it and that sort of thing.
So my impression is that, on occasion there are UU services, which I've either seen or heard about, where the sermon portion is more of like a motivational speech about something related to real life, something like you'd find perhaps in a Reformed Judaism temple, where they're focused on this life and the things that we do in this life. But I've also heard about UU churches where they're probably more deistic or vague theistic, where there's still an appeal to either a universal intelligence or a connectedness or even a God thing without, like you were saying, without the gender language.
Right. I think you'll see all of that, and it depends a lot on the church and the day you go, and sometimes you'll get very earth-centered pagan service where you actually might get up and do a pagan ritual or a dance or walk a labyrinth, or it could be anything.
I think one of the things that surprises me most about the UU Church is that we see lots of religious conflict in the world. And there's over 1,000 denominations that identify, sorry, I'm having problems with my earbud, that identify as Christian, and they disagree on every single point of doctrine, including whether or not Jesus actually lived or existed as a real person, or whether this is a metaphoric tale. And, you end up with the First Baptist Church, the Second Baptist Church, and the Third Baptist Church because of disagreements when they're almost in exact alignment. And yet you've got a UU Church, and I know there have been some splits, and obviously people have had disagreements. But I would think that getting a collection of people where somebody is an incredibly liberal, kind of progressive Christian, somebody else is a deist, somebody else is a pagan, somebody else is an atheist, and we're going to try to make something that appeals to all of them. Mm-hmm. I think you might as well just get out a deck of cards and play a game, because everything else is. I don't know why it doesn't cause people to just walk out every time. But
yeah, it's an interesting, and it's generally people who can get together and just kind of listen to what the other people think and not object to it, at least, or at least say, oh, that's interesting, that you...
I think there's a temperament which I have objections to, and that is agreeing to disagree. Mm-hmm. I have no problem at all agreeing that we, in fact, do disagree. But I find that when people do let's just agree to disagree, it's... I view it as an admission that they just lost the argument. But I think the feeling that I get from it is more of there's no way to know which one of us is right. Mm-hmm. And that I don't necessarily think is true, but it depends on the issue.
Right, yeah, because sometimes there is a way to know. You can test things and come up with the best answer.
Yeah, and that's where we get into discussions about, how to label, atheism or whatever else. Because if a theism is, I believe that a God exists, and atheism is, I do not believe that a God exists. Well, when we talk about, is there good reason to believe that a God exists? I think that, clearly I think that any reasoned evaluation of the case, the answer has to be no. There's no good reason to believe this. There's tons and tons of bad reasons, which is how we've been doing a show all these years. But